Hey kids! I bet you've heard the expression, or maybe even the song, walk like an Egyptian. Walk like an Egyptian. It's simple. You put one hand behind you, down low, pointing backwards, and one hand in front, higher up, pointing forwards. Then you strut. Can you walk like an Egyptian? It's hard to imagine that the ancient Egyptians really walked that way, but however they did walk, no ancient culture captures our imagination quite like the Egyptians do. So just what was ancient Egypt, and when did they live? Well, let's start by defining some terms. An ancient civilization is a society that existed a long time ago, that had a spectacular rise and fall, and then became a model for future societies. In modern times, we have advanced technology, transportation, big stores, lots of schools and roads. But all of that had to start somewhere. Most of the ideas that led to many of the conveniences we have in modern life began during ancient times. Some of the other ancient civilizations that you may have heard of include the ancient Greeks, Romans, the Persians, Mayans, Aztec, and Incas. These groups were all from different places in the world and all left behind different but equally memorable architecture, art, teachings, and other parts of culture that made them unique. We owe almost all our ideas and the way we look at the world itself to these ancient civilizations. Out of all the ancient societies, the ancient Egyptian civilization is one of the most successful, having lasted almost 3,000 years. That's more than 10 times the number of years that the United States has even existed. So what are the first things that pop into your mind when you think about the ancient Egyptian civilization? Let me guess. Pyramids? King Tut? Their cool gods? Cleopatra? Mummies? The Sphinx? All of the above? There is a lot to unpack when it comes to ancient Egypt, so let's dive right in. First, it's important to know where in the world the ancient Egyptians set up shop. They were here, right along the banks of the Nile River in what is now northern Africa. Being close to the Nile River was critical to the ancient Egyptians, as a reliable water source is a big part of a culture's success. You gotta have drinking water, right? You need water for your crops, and rivers are full of fish to eat. Rivers are great for transportation, and it didn't hurt that access to the Nile quickly took them into the open sea so they could trade and travel. The Nile is so long, almost 4,000 miles, that the thriving society that ancient Egyptians set up along its banks ultimately influenced the growth of other African countries far to the south, such as Kenya, Eritrea, Uganda, Tanzania, and others. Almost all the famous sites that the ancient Egyptians left behind line the banks of this storied river, and it's the Nile that we can basically thank for this great civilization. The Nile flows all the way from down here at Lake Victoria, one of the largest lakes in the world, up through Africa into Egypt, and then it empties into the Mediterranean Sea. That's some river! Because weather was bone dry in Egypt with very little rain, it was the Nile flooding every year that allowed the Egyptians to plant crops, irrigate the soil, and have food. Plus, it provided fish and birds and other food sources that allowed the Egyptians to thrive. One of the most famous and important crops that the Egyptians grew was a reed called papyrus, which was used to make paper. In fact, the word papyrus is where we get the word paper from. Papyrus reeds could grow to be 16 feet tall. That's almost 3 times the size of a small adult. But ancient Egypt was not just one time period. It lasted so long that historians have had to break it down into 3 separate kingdoms: Old, Middle, and New. Not super creative, but it tells you all you need to know. Each of those kingdoms was further broken down into dynasties. A dynasty was a time in which the civilization was ruled by a specific family or group of leaders. You even hear that word today, like when a sports team wins a lot of championships in a row, we call it a dynasty. So here's a quick and easy way to remember the 3 kingdoms of Egypt. The Old Kingdom lasted from about 2575 BCE to 2150 BCE. This kingdom was known as the Age of Pyramids, when the Great Pyramid of Giza was built. Ever wonder how they built those things? It's not like you can lift rocks weighing several tons. This was a prosperous time where trade and art were flourishing. They built ships, and the art created here was imitated for the next 3,000 years. The Middle Kingdom lasted from 1975 BCE to 1640 BCE. During this kingdom, all of Egypt was unified under a pharaoh, a word that meant great house in their ancient language. During this time, the capital of Egypt moved from Memphis, no, not the one in Tennessee, to Thebes. The army expanded, the economy boomed, and they started making large block statues. And the use of papyrus to write down stories really took off. This was the beginning of storytelling. The New Kingdom started about 1520 BCE and lasted until 1075 BCE. This was the golden age of wealth, prosperity, and power. Maybe it's because they had a 10-year-old become king during this period. No, seriously. A 10-year-old named Ahmose I united the kingdom around 1540 BCE. That's a lot of power for a 10-year-old, and a lot of pressure. Other famous kings during this period were Ramses II, Thutmose III, and the most famous of all, King Tutankhamun, or King Tut. After that, it was all downhill for the Egyptians. Famine, drought, and invasions from the Sea People of Libya started their decline. Eventually, their last pharaoh was Ramses XI, and in about 650 BCE, the Assyrians took over. So, what was life like for them? When it came to their homes, there was a definite difference in where you live based on how much money you had. The nobles, the upper class, and the leaders typically had big houses with up to 30 rooms along the Nile River, while peasants and lower classes had smaller houses that were much closer together. All of the houses were made from bricks that they invented, fashioned from mud and straw. Because the weather was so dry, these houses were quite sturdy. Not only was it dry, but it was also hot in Egypt, and it still is today. So the clothes they wore were loose-fitting. Men mostly sported short kilts over top loincloths, and the women wore straight dresses. Servants were distinguished from the others by wearing patterned fabrics, and the children went naked until about 5 or 6. There was no sunscreen, so it must have been hard to avoid getting sunburned. Like in modern Egypt, they ate a lot of bread, fruits, vegetables, and lamb and goat for meat. Their fruits were things like dates, plums, figs, grapes, raisins, and melons, while their vegetables included onions, leeks, beans, lettuce, and others. They had a very healthy diet. Just like we do today, they also made beer from barley and wine from grapes or plums. Most people during ancient Egypt worked as farmers because the land near the Nile was so fertile, and they needed to grow their own food. Other jobs included craftsmen like potters, weavers, jewelry makers, and carpenters. Some more educated and wealthier people were also scribes, meaning they wrote things down on papyrus using hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics was an ancient language using symbols to represent words. Archaeologists have discovered a lot of hieroglyphics in the ancient tombs of Egypt. If your name was a hieroglyphic, what would it look like? Mine would be a guy reading into a microphone. Kids in ancient Egypt were well treated, with girls getting preferential treatment since boys were considered troublemakers. All kids were encouraged to become strong and athletic through game playing. Hey, that sounds fun, doesn't it? Well, not so fast. Life wasn't that easy for kids in ancient Egypt. Because of disease and wild animals all around, almost half the kids didn't live past the age of 5. If they did survive, they were considered adults by age 13. I guess if you made it that far, you earned it. Of course, any video about ancient Egypt wouldn't be complete without mentioning their gods, which included Ra, the sun god, Isis, the mother goddess, Osiris, who was the goddess of the dead, Horus, the god of the sky, and Thoth, the god of knowledge. Now that you know so much about ancient Egypt, do you feel a little bit like Thoth? Now a staple of our modern-day Halloween, mummies were a big part of the ancient Egypt culture too. They preserved bodies after they died by wrapping them up and embalming them. They believed in the afterlife, so creating mummies was a way to prepare them for what lay ahead. Some of the most famous mummies preserved to this day are those of King Tut and King Ramses the Great. There may have been as many as 70 million mummies created during the 3,000 years. Hey, that's like 23,000 mummies a year! Last, but definitely not least, are the Egyptian pyramids. Those giant, amazing structures that still exist today. They were used as memorials and burial places for the pharaohs. Because of their belief in the afterlife, the pyramids were used to store treasure, food, religious artifacts, texts, and more. Everything you'd need to be transported to the next life. They were even buried with a mummified pet on occasion. The largest pyramid built was a whopping 480 feet tall, and it could take thousands of workers 20 years to build just one. Totally worth it. So that's ancient Egypt in a nutshell. An amazing, colorful, and wildly successful civilization that left so much behind that we still cherish today. Archaeologists are still discovering more about these ancient peoples all the time, and there are many mysteries to uncover. Now, if you'll excuse me, it's time to walk like an Egyptian over to the fridge for a snack.
Thanks for following Clarendon Learning. Be sure to subscribe. For more free resources, check us out at clarendonlearning.org.